The story begins when the German military was really concerned that its standard issue rifle was too big and too bulky and required too much practice to shoot well for it to be an effective personal defense weapon for a lot of soldiers whose primary role wasn't infantry. Men like artillery crews and air crews. They needed something that was a lot more compact, more portable, and easier to use, something that wouldn't get in the way of their primary duties than the standard issue rifle. And so Germany's largest and most famous arms manufacturer started putting out a much more compact, high-capacity, sort of a personal defense weapon that could still be pushed into use at long range to combat enemy threats. This could be the MP7, or it could be 100 years earlier with the Lange Pistole 08. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I thought it would be interesting today to take a look at the origin of the first German assault weapon. And I don't use that term loosely because this term comes from the German Sturm, as in Sturmgewehr, or Sturmtruppen, or Sturmgeschütz. And it's a term that was first applied, in fact, to Sturmkompanie of assault troops in World War I who were specifically equipped with this, what's typically called the Artillery Luger. In order to properly understand the origins of the Artillery Luger, you first need to know a couple of details about German artillery, because they were split into two branches, the field artillery and the foot artillery. Now, the foot artillery are guys who are marching from A to B on foot. They typically have heavy guns, and they're the ones who are sort of significantly back behind the lines, launching long-range fire support missions, or bombardment of long-range targets. On the alternative hand, you have the field artillery. These guys are all mounted. They're essentially cavalry artillery. They're mobile, they're fast-moving, they're dynamic, they have much lighter guns. They're the ones who are much closer to the front lines, providing direct support for attacking or defending infantry. Now, the armaments required for these two branches are substantially different. The foot artillery from time to time have to be able to sort of backfill the infantry role. They're given a carbine. They have the Gewehr 91, which is essentially the carbine version of the Gewehr 88 standard service rifle. Bolt action, 8mm Mauser, etc. That's not really a suitable weapon for the field artillery, though. These guys are all on horseback. They want something, or they need something, or they want and need something that is lighter and less obtrusive than a full carbine. So even when World War I starts, these guys are still primarily being issued with Reichsrevolvers, model 1879 and 1883 black powder single-action revolvers. Because really, they're not supposed to be using sidearms anyway. Well, it's recognized that they probably ought to give them something a little more modern in the years leading up to World War I, and so trials begin. And they test out the Luger, but there's concern that, well, what if we could do something a little bit better than the Luger? What if we could make essentially a Luger carbine, a detachable shoulder stock on a long-barreled Luger? And so that's where the idea for the LP08, Lange Pistole, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly, it's the Long Pistol 08, and that was the official designation. And it wasn't just for the artillery. The designation Artillery Luger is something that has been coined by collectors and historians today, and it doesn't appear anywhere in original German literature. Now, the other troops who were supposed to be receiving and using these guns included fortress troops, again, guys who are going to be stationed inside a defensive fortification. Their real job is man the guns of that fortification, or supplying ammunition for them. Unless things go really terribly wrong, you shouldn't have to use your own personal individual weapon. And air crews, pilots, observers, gunners, well, gunners would come a little bit later, pilots and observers in aircraft. Again, this is before the introduction of machine guns or even self-loading rifles on aircraft. You want to have some sort of weapon in case you have to crash land in enemy territory. And perhaps, well, some guys would get the idea to start shooting at other pilots with these things, but whatever that weapon is, it's gotta be light and it's gotta be handy, because you're not waving around Gewehr 98 in the confines of a 1912 pilot's cockpit. And so those three units together are the ones who are supposed to get this. This pistol is formally adopted in 1913, and it takes this form, albeit with just the standard magazine. When this is introduced, it just uses regular Luger magazines, 8-round capacity. What's interesting, though, is the gun never gets to most of those guys. The air service actually gets some of these guns, but when World War I begins, very, very few of them, only a handful of these, have actually trickled into service. And those usually don't have standard holsters or shoulder stocks on them. Guys are still going without shoulder stocks, and they're kind of making do, hand-making holsters or getting small batches of holsters from, local suppliers. It would take a year or two before the supply of all of those ancillary items actually caught up to the production of the pistols themselves. So the pilots are getting some of the guns. The artillery, the existing artillery units, basically never get these pistols. When World War I starts, that's when production really actually starts on these guns. And it takes a while, many months, if not a full year, for production to really get into any sort of real quantity. And once it does, the pistols are being issued to newly formed units that are being put together and then sent off to the front. Guys who are already at the front, well, they get to keep their Reichsrevolvers. Best of luck to you. Now, in mid-1916, we see a few changes start to happen. And essentially what happens is the soldiers on the ground realize that there's a lot of potential firepower in this thing. It's very light. It's very handy. By the time we get to 1916, we have real trench warfare that has developed, and trench raiding is not really well suited to long bolt-action rifles. There are some carbines around, sure, but the Germans don't have a good light machine gun. There is no submachine gun basically in existence yet. And so guys discover that this little stocked pistol is super handy for close-range combat. And at about this same time, a gentleman by the name of Freidrich Blum out of Budapest has designed a drum magazine. Now, he actually originally designs this drum magazine for use with the Mondragon semi-auto rifles that were contracted from SIG by Mexico. Mexico couldn't pay for them all. SIG had a bunch left over. The German Air Force purchases these semi-automatic rifles from SIG to use as aircrew guns because they're going to be a little more effective than just pistols or, the shotguns that you hear about early pilots taking up with them to attack other aircraft. Well, in order to increase the fire capacity of those guns, Blum designs a drum magazine for them, which the Germans actually use in limited numbers on Mondragon rifles. This was called the model of 1915 Flieger Selbstladgewehr, the flyer's self-loading rifle. Blum takes his patent for that drum and adapts it to the Luger. Points out, here's another place where an increased capacity could really work well. The pistol already uses a detachable magazine. We can take that, the main body of the magazine and kludge a drum onto the bottom of it, and we can increase the capacity of this pistol from 8 rounds to 32 rounds, which is huge in World War I. There's really nothing on the Allied side anywhere like this. The Pedersen device wouldn't come around until 1918. It would never actually be used. So when you get the magazines combined with the trench warfare that's developing, this becomes the assault weapon. And in fact, now it would take a while. Once the drums are first, they're introduced for the rifles in 1915, 1916. You get the idea for the pistol ones in 1916. They're adopted. They're actually put into the German pistol manuals for the LP08. There's a manual that's printed at the very beginning of 1917 that has all the details on the drums, and the Germans were anticipating having drums ready, and yet, as so often does happen, things were delayed quite a bit. And they didn't get the drums until summer of 1917, maybe even the fall of 1917. It takes a long time for these relatively complicated drums to actually get into field service. Once they do, in fact, in February of 1918, there is an order published by the German High Command that actually, for the first time ever, uses the word Sturm in sort of the assault context. It describes the issuing of long pistol 08s, artillery Lugers, to Sturmkompanie, so companies of elite assault troops who are going to be attacking enemy trenches. And they're being issued these pistols with the trommel drum 32-round magazines. And that's where, that is the first German assault weapon. Now, these would be used throughout the war. They, from the point they were first introduced, they were in continuous use until the end of the war. The Germans would introduce a true submachine gun in the summer, early fall of 1918. It saw limited use at the front for all the same reasons. It takes a long time to get this stuff actually from the drawing board to the factory to the production line to actually in the field. But that MP-18, the Lange Pistole 18, would use the same trommel drum magazine as the Luger. It was the magazine that they had available. It was the only high-capacity magazine, essentially, out there in existence for the German military. So they adapt that to their new submachine gun. After the war, they would transition those guns, modify them to use sort of traditional box magazines instead, once those are put into production. But the submachine gun, which we think of as the classic weapon of the Sturmtruppen, is actually the follow-on, the replacement for the first Sturmtruppen weapon, which is the Artillery Luger. So it's a little bit ironic that we call it the Artillery Luger when, in fact, the artillery were probably the least significant users of it. Yes, it was originally designed for them, but the people who actually used it were aviators early on, and then the assault troops, primarily the assault troops. So in total, 178,000 of these pistols are made by the end of the war. Serial numbers on the drums go up to 800,000, which is huge. Now, that number kind of does fit with production of the pistols. The plans for issuing these guns, and it's not clear exactly to what extent they were able to meet these goals, but the plan was essentially every company would get 10 pistols and 100 magazines. So they're not anticipating that you're reloading these magazines on the fly. You're going to get a big old pile of loaded magazines, which you then load before you go out in the field with them. And you're not probably going to be reloading these things on the move. So it's possible that they did make 800,000 of the magazines. It's also possible there are some holes and gaps in that serial number range. This one, by the way, is in the 450,000 range for that drum. So after the war, it was recognized that these were like serious cutting-edge combat weapons. The Treaty of Versailles and its supplementary notes essentially prohibit the military and police use of long-barreled pistols, which is a specifically targeted thing at these guns. Now, some of them survived anyway. They appear to have been particularly popular guns for disbanded troops and regular civilians to stash away illegally and keep. And there are some incidents, like the German Navy did also have issue of long-barreled artillery Lugers in addition to the naval Lugers. They got some of these for their own naval infantry units to do the exact same thing that the army was doing with them. But apparently the British general in charge, or admiral, in charge of dealing with weapons restrictions for the German Navy after the war didn't really pay attention or care to barrel length, so a lot of the German naval ones survive. And overall, a higher percentage than one might expect of these pistols survive, given that they were not supposed to go into official Weimar government or police use or inventory. Anyway, I think it's a fantastically interesting adaptation of a pistol, something that, again, starts as, like, it's the story that repeats itself so many different times, that a weapon is designed to be light and handy and unobtrusive for rear echelon troops, and it turns into the primary favorite weapon of the elite special forces, essentially. We see it with the MP7, we see it with the FNP90, to some extent we see it with the M1 carbine, not so much specialized assault troops with M1 carbines, but it goes from being a weapon for drivers and machine gunners and artillery crew to being a weapon that everybody loves to get their hands on. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.